Hi, it's Ileana at Awakening Cosmic Reality Show, and we have Daniel Sala with us. We're going to cover Radu Cinamar's book 7. Daniel, what is the name of the 7th book?
Yeah, it's the Etheric crystal, and the subtitle is The Third Tunnel. And yeah, it deals with a pretty much potpourri of all the other themes of the book. I think we left off with the creation of humanity, the seeding, and then I hyped up this book that I think is pretty much my favorite, and it starts off with the aforementioned third tunnel, and it actually is the only one that has multiple ramifications, not just straight ahead. It goes also to the curvature of the Carpathian Mountains and also to the Tibet and the Gobi Desert, and the middle ramification goes to Iraq. And Radu describes how by this point he was I believe the third in command after Cesar and Lieutenant Nicoire. He got to climb the ranks there after making so much progress with the interterrestrials and all that. And he says that despite the time that passed, the complex is still so exclusive that only 9 scientists have even entered. So you're not going to find just about anyone there. So and the technology continues to be so elusive in many cases that it's even beyond the scope of reverse engineering. That's not always the case, but it is, for example, with this particular room, which we're going to see. So unlike the other tunnels, they had much faster access here. All it took for them to go from Romania to Iraq were a few sets of portals, but just separated a few minutes apart. And he remarked how much of a boon that would be to humanity if you could reduce travel time. It would such a small advancement that would change everything for the better. And the discontinuity or the portal did have a slight effect on the cellular level, particularly the mitochondria. But apparently, with enough training, you would get to overcome that. And one example of that is Cesar, who always got a physical after these trips and was fine despite being the most active of all. And so they are not allowed to disclose about the other 2 ramifications, even though they are extremely significant. And the one to Iraq, which, by the way, you can only access if you're going through Romania first. That's why it was closed off. In Iraq, it was useless for the Freemason in the first book. But if you have enough of a refined consciousness to pass the barrier in Romania, then you can deactivate it through the similar panel with triangle with a tip up on the wall, and you press that. And Cesar was the first guy who did that. But by the way, it's specific to that one person. No one else can activate it. He even Radu tried, and nothing happened. It had to be Cesar. And the room, the occult room, also, just like the Egypt one, and it's quite similar, but has its own characteristics, of course. It was a little smaller. This case was 7 meters long and 6 wide, and it wasn't separated by stone, but by simply a protective energetic layer that was indigo, and that they managed to trigger the dematerialization of with that panel. And so other than that, it was pretty sparse, the room. There were niches on the walls that were irregular shaped, which housed also tablets, but they were not platinum. They were made of crystal, and they were tougher to decipher as well. That was their mission, actually, just to retrieve those and categorize them. And then the other objective was to get to the bottom of this centerpiece of the room, which was this special chair. And it was the only device in this whole complex that eluded them. They could not start. And they even employed two Americans with extremely cutting edge technology that would, through thermal imagery, detect any slight change in the atmosphere, just to look for the etheric crystal, which was the missing component in launching this chair, which was expected to be similar to the one in Egypt, but not the same, which it turned out to be. So they couldn't find it with their proprietary technology, but using the special goggles that Radu received from the Apollo civilization, which had 4 density overtones, he saw that there was an attachment next to the chair, which, by the way, had a lot of strange inscriptions, alien languages, that some of them he could recognize the symbols from the holographic projections. And it was made to fit a creature that was 2.5 meters, which is like 8 feet or so. And unfortunately, they couldn't get around this limitation, because even if they wanted to, because the device had certain rings or bands at the ends, so which connected to your feet and your head. So with these goggles, you could see at last the crystal, which was actually exactly where it's supposed to be, in this little attachment that was cylinder shaped, and it was completely invisible to the other people, because the goggles are also made to only fit Radu. So he could even sense it, and just looking at the crystal, he could feel a strong nostalgia, and like it was alive. And it was blue, it was tetrahedron shaped, and it was housed in a cylinder, but suspended in a force field that was invisible, so you could tilt it and it would remain in place. And when he touched, because it had 2 titanium-like rings on the top and the bottom, when he grabbed the one on the top, it suddenly activated the whole apparatus, and it glowed the whole chair in red lights, and it's produced hums and vibrations, and he played around with it, put it back and lifted it up again, and it's reduced in intensity, but still did the same thing. And when he picked it up completely, he got hit with unexpected download, but of the block variety. So it was really startling, and it lasted quite a bit. And at the end, he felt a certain communion with the crystal. And they still couldn't make use of the chair, but they retrieved it, the crystal, and we're about to have the researchers, look into it, and as well as the crystals, and then they went back in just a matter of minutes to Romania. So this leads me to my first question, which is, do you ever get communication yourself from crystals, and do you consider that they're alive?
Yeah, I do get communications from crystals. The very first crystal I ever connected to was a black obsidian skull, and I saw the consciousness of Alexander the Great, actually, and he was walking in some kind of a tunnel. He was wearing a dark robe and walking through a tunnel system underground. And I asked, "What are you doing?" And he said, "It's a secret mission that I'm on." And I asked, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Alexander the Great." And I'm like, why would I be seeing you in a crystal skull? And he told me that crystals are Akashic records and often can hold memories of somebody's past life. And when you have a certain frequency yourself, that you're connected to that crystal, you can connect with your relatives, you can connect with somebody you knew from previous lives. So I feel like I have a kinship with Alexander the Great, because I just had always a vibrational frequency connection to him after seeing him through that crystal skull. And that crystal skull, when the talk with Alexander was over, guess what the crystal skull told me? My name is Alexander the Great. and I hold the frequency of Alexander's soul vibration. I hold the memory of his lifetime. And I'm like, how can that be? You're a newer crystal. You weren't created thousands of years ago. And the crystal said to me, it doesn't matter when I was created. I'm a sentience and I hold the records of everything that is or will be. So this black obsidian crystal skull, and it's carved in a certain way. It's not your typical skull. The nose is different, the head is different. So it's not your typical crystal skull. And this is what drew me to it. And I love black obsidian because it has conducting properties. It could take you in your psychic abilities to different places in time and space, and it can connect you to different beings. Now, Alexander the Great is not alive, obviously. He was the leader of the Macedonians. He was a Greek leader. He was born in Greece. He went to Egypt. He also became like a pharaoh. He was crowned almost like a pharaoh in Egypt. He built the Library of Alexandria, which I'm also connected to on a holographic scale. I've seen the Library of Alexandria and been inside it. And when I hold clear quartz crystals, it amplifies my psychic ability and it allows me to go beyond my human body and to see something through consciousness, through a holographic aspect. It allows me to travel outside the body and connect with things in the universe and receive information.
Interesting. And you would say that this is just one display of what crystals can do, and they're part of a crystal collective, and they all have their own little specialty and traits, I guess, right? They're complex.
Yeah, crystals are sentient. They are alive. There's crystal quartz. There's other types of crystals that aren't quartz. There's bismuth that can open star gateway portals that can help you power ships. Crystals are used in crystalline engines on ships now to go beyond the speed of light. Because a crystal can be a solid, then it could be a liquid, and then it could go to a flow state, and then it could go back to the solid state again once the ship is out of hyperdrive. So crystals are being used in engines and off-world programs, whether human or extraterrestrial, they both use it now. So crystals have various properties, like the piezoelectric frequencies. Those piezoelectric frequencies of crystals, they can go from solid to liquid to flow state back to solid, and they are very transformative energetically. So they could power your computer, they could power your watch, they could power your cell phone as a battery. They can replace lithium batteries. Like a diamond can act as a battery for 1,000 years if it's used properly as a cell within a cell phone or a computer. It could power electronics, it could power ships. Crystals have infinite possibilities, what their energy could do, but the best use of them is for the metaphysical and healing properties, for clearing your own energy, for healing yourself. That's what I work with crystals to do, to heal. I know there are other capabilities, but for me, the healing and the nice energy, the purification process of the fact that clear quartz and amethyst and rose quartz can really clear bad energy. Turquoise as well and protect you. Like shungite and moldavite are very good protective crystals to protect you from entities and bad energy, from influencing your soul, your mind, your body, or infiltrating your body. So for me, crystals, it's more the metaphysical and the healing aspects that I'm interested in to work. And you can put crystals and staffs and wands for healing, or you can just hold them in your hands. You can be very creative how you allow the crystal to work with you.
Right. So in this case, unfortunately, this is, although it's titled the book after it, this is about where the story ends, because with the crystal, but we'll see how he will get to substitute it. So what it's left Radu with, the gift that it imparted, was this knowing that was basically on his cortex, and he just had to tap into it. And in time, he slowly, by jotting down anything that, because he could access every part of it, he just wrote it down and started little by little to make sense of it. He noticed that a lot of the symbols were actually intuitive, so he could just, also was helped by the goggles, and also that he recognized some of them, and he could use the replay mode of the goggles to think of the time he visited the chair and inspect it again, and combine that with his previous knowledge from the Akashic field. And so he noticed that he was starting to create the sketches of an equivalent device to the spatial chair, except it was less high technology. It was just more aimed towards him, because I don't know, maybe it's it doesn't say it's cryptic, but my interpretation is that it was a message maybe transmitted from the ET that made that base somehow, because it was so fortuitous. So he little by little deduced the function of it, and he saw that it was supposed to induce these electromagnetic waves of all types in him, just impulses, but really refined, really specific ones, and that would make use of these crystal-like jets that were in a circle and like this around his vertical column, but also perpendicularly. Those would be the emitters of these frequencies, and it was also comparable to the other chairs, which is also not too unlike the Montauk chair, for example, which is an amplifier of your thoughts. But in this case, it was much more so, if you want, like a really advanced remote viewing machine, and it allowed you to basically convert the etheric and even astral, which in these books it means fourth and fifth density information, into physical. And that was his best guess at the beginning, and it turned out quite accurate. And so he called this Project Eden, but he knew that, Radu, that because it was such an uncommon phenomenon, that he was never going to get the funds for all the materials, because it included a lot of special materials like noble metals and the many types of crystals, not just one. And he could only disclose it to Cesar, who is his, a good friend, and he took it very seriously, fortunately, and they set about to actually create it in the only place that they could at the time, because this type of telepathic transmission would never have gotten the light of day from the Romanian politics or even scientists. So they appealed to Eleanor's basement without even telling him at first, actually, and because it was pretty large, 8 meters by 8. So I also wanted to make a parallel. If you have ever experienced such downloads of the one and done type that you sometimes hear about in the SSP, and do you expect that we'll see them anytime soon, and are they efficient compared to the regular type of laborious learning?
I get all kinds of downloads. I got downloads several years ago how to create crystal staffs and wands and healing tools. I get all kinds of downloads about crystal spaceships. Mostly I do remote viewing, where I take my soul and I travel to a point of what I want to see, and I see it in fine detail to the best of my ability. I zoom in with my soul consciousness on something, and it's not your typical remote viewing. Some people can sense things, some people can feel things better, and some people can see it, some can't. So I'm like directing my students through their senses, through the feeling, through the sensing, through the feeling of emotion, to connect with the object, to connect with the being. If you can't see it, there's other ways of connecting to something. You connect to its energy field, to its source field of energy. because even inanimate objects have an energy field. Everything has an energy frequency, because it is created by something, by someone, and there's an energetic signature that is always left inside the object or around it. So you can connect with feeling and sensing to that. Then you start to see it holographically. Even if you can't see it physically in the beginning, because you connect to that energetic field, that energy of the being, the object, the place, you start to holographically see it because you're accessing its energetic field. Everything and anything is energy fields. You can access that, you can start to see it holographically. Then you don't just need to use your eyes because you're seeing in a higher dimensional capacity. You're seeing the holographic creation of the object and the energy field. So I teach my students beyond just seeing, feeling and sensing and holographically connecting to the object using all of your abilities. So it is about, when you're receiving downloads and uploads, you also check, is this a real download and upload? What are you receiving? Is this information genuine? Is it valid? Are you supposed to have it? How are you supposed to work with it? I always make sure whatever I receive is for my highest good. That why am I receiving it? What is it? And what am I supposed to do with it? Those are the checks and balances I go through with any type of downloads, because I need to know what's going on with me and what I'm receiving. As above, so below. Sometimes I'm receiving from the universe directly. Sometimes I'm receiving information from source creator, the creator of everything that is or will be. You could call it God, you could call it spirit, you could call it source creator, you could call it whatever you want. The highest frequency of creation. Sometimes I get the information from source creator. Sometimes I get it from my higher self or from messages from extraterrestrials. I work with many different positive beings and energies and frequencies. So my downloads could be different. It's never the same thing. It could be shown to me in different ways as well.
Cool. I wanted to add this context about, because you rarely hear in depth about the block downloads. So, but the group went ahead with, which is a very small group, tight knit, and so they went about adapting this new device. And before that, he goes back in time a little bit to describe some of the wrong thinking of the current establishment in regards to science, which is that when we look at anything, that there is any volume underneath just the very surface. So take an apple, even if you bite in it, you just see the crease on the top, and you can alter it by biting into it, but it's still nothing. It's just you're looking at infinity just past it. So all you're actually seeing is just a visual feedback, and you need to understand that it's all illusion. And he gives the example also, if the dolphins or bats that just send sounds and receive back, what we don't know is that we're actually just doing the same thing, but with our eyes. And that's a good analogy of how there's actually nothing outside of these perceptions. So, which is another, way of saying that we are actually manifesting it. Although, of course, it's a collective process. So that was courtesy of this information of Dr. Shen, by the way. And anyway, then the first step that Cesar singles out as the most important before they even get cooking with the project is to find the best timing from the point of view of astrology to start this endeavor. And so he hires two specialists, and they spend a lot of time and put a lot of work in to realize that there's a good 4-month window in which it's the planetary and stellar influences would lead to the most fortuitous, all things taken into account, result. And then it gives some examples how astrology is really misunderstood, that it's understood by a few, and then even if you do get behind it, you shouldn't think that just because basically nothing, it's like the difference between thinking that everything is left to chance versus nothing is left to chance. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that you're ever subjugated by it. You can, through willpower, overcome the burdensome aspects of it, of the influences. So you should just look at it as a beneficial thing. And also that because everything is vibration, like we established in book 4, that also means that it's subject to a certain rhythm, and you need to get in line, and no one is, outside of this matrix is going to bypass that. So you need to get in harmony with the rest of the universe, and that's how you'll receive support and help from the higher celestial entities. And yeah, he also has to, in substituting the actual crystal part, he needs to recruit an IT specialist. And the reason being that this will deal with the frequencies, with the energetic frequencies. So you have to have a really refined software for that. And fortunately, Romania is quite replete with IT specialists, and he was notorious in these circles because he would simply go through these agencies and just show them up, go through them like they were nothing, and show them up in terms that he would just send them emails afterwards explaining what was wrong with their security. So he wouldn't actually, at the same time, he said that if he wanted to, he could affect and manipulate and leave no trace. And that alerted a lot of suspicion. At the same time, he was highly courted by the American agencies, but he never buckled. He remained an independent agent, but still. So Radu knew of him from some previous few years ago, and he recruited him, and his nickname was Midas. And he wasn't clued into these higher densities and esoteric, practices, but with just a little bit of, because he was heavily compartmentalized, these guys that they hired, with just a little bit of suggestion, he was able to quickly catch on. And before long, he considered this project to be his finest work after, months, and the biggest challenge of his life. So it worked out in that sense. And I forgot to finish the astrology part, that beside the timing, they also, Cesar placed a plate that had a carving of a certain Syrian symbol that they spent a long time choosing, him and Radu, that sounded like Shikara, which means, translates to vital energy that comes from divine light. And they placed it in copper that was plated with gold and in the center of the room, and it was supposed to, manifest that, what it said. And it seems maybe unnecessary, but he insists that the higher in scope the project, the more these things are necessary. Next, he goes into the actual Syrian language, how it's abstract, but at the same time nuanced. It's based on dots and lines, and the dots always signify the start of an action. And sometimes there are a cluster of them, but that means that you need to pay attention to that cluster. And the other big component is just lines. So it's simplistic, but it gets very, very complex. The lines represent, the horizontal ones have to do with time and repetition, and the vertical ones with advancement. And for example, if you have a dot on the bottom and the line over it, that means more rudimentary creatures like humans who are aspiring to be closer to God. And then if you have, say, a dot on top and a dot in the middle through which a line, goes through, that signifies God and also higher density beings who are exerting their influence on the lower ones, which are in this case us, I guess. Then it shows how K is seen in all cultures, but this was its origin. And it also has to do with, so when you have multiple offshoots like that, it means that the K, you have not just God, but also other celestial entities that are exerting their influence on the lower ones. And then it depends on where the dots are in the K. But the K is also allegedly behind the pi symbol, if you just turn around. And anyway, the Syrian language doesn't have actions or like we would know. It doesn't have, you can't write poems with it. It has to do with more fundamental and energetic or even archetypal realities. And you can see them sometimes, for example, on ships, just to remind them of something. And but yeah, just one symbol is enough to describe like hundreds of words in some instances. And they have been adapted by our cultures in a big way, not just Syrian, but the most one apparently Syrian, because they were our first architects. And the many of the symbols that we think came from mathematicians are actually just variations of those. Actually, what's interesting is that the ENL creatures, all the way from the beginning of them to Atlantis, around the last iteration of Atlantis, you didn't actually see much writing, and that's because they simply didn't need it. You could say they were more meditative, the NLs, they were more telepathic. So when you have that, you don't really need our type of language. What this turns out to be, our necessity for language, or at least the version that we have, is just a knowledge transfer that we couldn't really do without. So we came up with it. And the earliest one was similar to cuneiform, which can be seen like Hittite civilization. And in the beginning, it was much more nuanced than it is today. Much of its meaning has gotten lost in time. So yeah, I also wanted to splice in here, if you can give us some insight into ET languages from what you've seen. I believe you were tasked with acting as a mediator for ET civilizations in your SSP experience.
Yes, when I was on the Mars bases and sometimes on the ships themselves, they have huge holographic libraries of all the known extraterrestrial languages. So you have to start looking at every letter, every symbol, and each species has their own symbols, right? Just like one symbol can mean 5 sentences in a discussion in a certain language. So you have to, in the database, translate that into English. So one symbol, like anything like this, could mean, how can we go home? Just for an example. So, and each language is different. They're not very similar, what I was studying. So for me, it was like I had to translate. One symbol could mean a sentence. So you don't really use it to form a word. It is already a sentence. So that's how you have to transcribe it into English. What exactly it means is what exactly you put down as the translation, and there's no variation. You can't deviate what you think it means. You have to put the exact translation of what the symbol is, of what the letter is, and what the words make, and what a sentence makes. So not every language that is extraterrestrial the same, and some extraterrestrials don't use language at all because they're telepathic. So,
Cool. But were those belonging to a specific civilization, and was there maybe one that was all encompassing, or that was
no,
you
it's not all encompassing, not at all. It's different civilizations, different beings. I'm not going to get into which language belonged. Some of it was Pleiadian, some of it was Arcturian. The Arcturian language is much more, there's a lot more waves to it. There's a lot more flow. Pleiadian is like this, Arcturian more like this. So, and Arcturian is very poetic. Pleiadian is more like time travel, portals, energy frequency, whereas Arcturian is wisdom, it's flow. It's how do you evolve from a flow? That's how I felt about these two languages. Pleiadian teaches you from point A to B to C to D. Arcturian is flow. I could sense the energetic frequency of the different languages as well. Because when I saw the symbols, they would glow. Blue, green, yellow. Every language, every symbol in these holographic databases would glow a different color. And that had an energetic frequency to that language.
Wow. No, I'm glad I'm asked, because both of those civilizations make plenty of appearances in the series. And so next, he also makes flashback to the time he spoke with the Apelos person who was sitting by him during the holographic projections. His conversation with him, where he explained that there are no constants, gave the example of the symbol pi, that it's supposed to be 3.14 and so on, and that it's actually just a lazy approximation on the part of our scientists to believe that the reason for that is that you simply don't have a perfect circle anywhere in the universe, or a perfect sphere, or any solid for that matter. And of course, it sounds absurd, like blasphemy, but then just think how even the biggest sphere that you can think of, just let's say a star, has a lot of discrepancies if you look in detail. And the same with, if you're, say, let's say digital, go digital, then if you go in enough detail, it's just pixels at some point. So what he described is a fractal algorithm, and it changes the more energy you put into its like application. And it's the same with, for example, the speed of light. I mean, it is in a vacuum, theoretically going constant way, but there is no vacuum. So it always is going to travel slower or faster depending on where it is in the universe. And that actually incidentally accounts for the many things, but also the red shift and blue shift, which is, our misinterpretation of the expanding universe. So also they go into how electrons are actually also an approximation. They shouldn't even be called that. I mean, they do exist in the sense that there's something there and they create this, what's called a cloud in our science, but that's wrong. The problem is we don't have the technology to measure it, so we just write it off as something else. But in lieu of that technology, I guess it's better to call them that than call them nothing. So the first experiments are pretty coarse. They do have a large effect on Radu, but they are quite unpleasant and quite ambiguous as well by the descriptions. He doesn't manage to actually access the etheric until a lot of software changes. And the biggest reason why it was so jarring to begin with, it turns out, is that they didn't pay attention to, like we were saying with the constants, when it comes to the higher densities, you need to pay attention to the details, and you will reap the rewards of that if you do. And so the oversight on the part of Midas, and it was the first time that Radu said he ever saw him be dejected in his life, was that he made the mistake of limiting the certain parameters to the first 5 decimals, whereas they went on to 9 decimals. So that was just his routine, his instinct, but it served no use. So after he addressed this, it went into much more detail. I mean, the energetic impulses into not just his cellular level, but even to the what's called the quantum level. And he managed to make his first conscious duplication, which is felt like a liminal place between being awake and being asleep. And he also mentions here that every density actually, your consciousness has its representation in each density. It's just that you're not aware of the other ones for the vast majority of the time. As for example, now we're in talking, even if we wanted to, we're still in 3D. Just there's ways to tell. So you, of course, you can induce out of body, and I was going to ask you right after this if you have any tips on how to achieve that. But you, when you do that, you're then giving up, so to speak, on the physical. So yeah, can you give us like an idea what do you do to induce the out of body experiences?
I do a lot of astral traveling. I do a lot of remote viewing. I basically clear my mind of all active thought, and I just leave the body at rest. I leave it at home, and my soul leaves the body and goes out to do whatever it needs to do. So I don't concentrate on the physicality of the body, of the 3D. I can easily blur that out from my existence and just go. For me, it's like instant, less than a minute. I don't need to meditate for 40, 50, 30 minutes to go out of body. For me, it's already like, I'm now going to go. I'm leave my body safely protected at rest. It's protected from any outside entities, from any outside interferences. I work on my energy shield bubble. I expand it, and I have different colors in my auric field, expanding the shield bubble. I cloak myself for my protection, and I just simply boom out the body, because I know I exist on multiple levels of realities. This is just a physical body, but it's not a representation of my soul capacity or soul frequency. I know that I'm not limited by anything energetically and physically. Just knowing that, it allows me to go easily, to leave the body, because I'm not hampered by any density or heaviness. I know that that is just a feeling of the body. You can easily bypass that feeling and leave. For some people, it's harder because they're so anchored in human life every day. If they don't practice this, it's hard to leave the body. I just do it because I know this is just a density. This is a frequency of a physical body, but I am not my total physicality. I am outside the body quite a bit energetically. So just knowing that I can go beyond these limits of human thought patterns and thought forms, I can easily leave. And I'm not hampered by physicality or 3D reality. I might be talking to you in 3D, but I'm already planning something else that I am doing already. An idea, a form, a thought, when I'm in the process of doing. So I'm here with you semi-presently, but I'm also doing something somewhere else already in a project, in a process.
Of course, we're all multi. I mean, that's no question about it. I just meant that overwhelmingly, I mean, if you're physical, then that's where most of your attention to. That it's, I don't know if you can be on multiple ones at once. I mean, I'm not sure. It's
yeah, I can. I'm always on multiple places and doing something already. Like, I'm always planning something, and it's beyond 3D. Again, to me, I understand that this is a physical density body, but it's not a holding vessel for me. My soul is just inhabiting a small portion of this body, but my soul is huge, and my soul goes wherever it wants. There's no limiter on where I can go and what I can do. Just understanding that, I can easily go, boom, I'm out of here. I can do my special stuff in my energy field body. Like, I have another body type that's pure energy, that is the soul, that is out there doing something, looking at something, experimenting with something, exploring. Like, I can give you an example. Today I was getting ready for this interview, and on my way, I just, I finished something, and then I grabbed my pendulum and I asked the same question 3 times, and I got the answer, and I saw something about what I was asking the pendulum. So I wrote it down, then I quickly went to brush my teeth. I did this in the span of 3 minutes, that set of things, because I know time is not a limiter to me. I can do it very quickly. I can use a pendulum to ask something, get answers within a minute, asking 3 questions within a minute, write down what I saw beyond what the pendulum was showing me, and then go and do something else, like brush my teeth. because time is not a limitation when your abilities open and expanded. Just work with your tools because you're open already beyond time and space.
Oh, well, you make a good argument there, so I'm not going to argue with it. But yeah, and the thing is that it sounds like you're naturally more inclined to get out of body, and for Radu, it was a novelty, despite him being, from the best I can tell, in his early 50s, around the time this book was written, which was some 7 years ago. I mean, the events took place, and he expresses his regret to Eleanor, who I forgot to mention that by this time he comes back to his villa because he was on regular trips, and when he finds out about it and that they had some financial difficulties, he just altruistically offers to finance to back it himself, which they gladly take him up on. And then he expresses Radu, his regret that he only gets into this practice so late in life. And when Eleanor gives him some advice about what he should do in order to last longer in these trips and go deeper, Radu replies that that would take years, and he would much rather, if possible, get a sort of boost, seeing as he's one of the most skilled alchemists, and he obliges and gives Radu what's called an essence. So later explains that in alchemy the hierarchy is extract, then tincture, which has a different meaning there, and then essence, and then elixir, and above that is the elixir of life, and which is the supreme creation, and that pretty much makes you immortal, makes you a god of man. But the essences are also extremely vitalizing if they're done right, which they still take a lot of effort. And in this case, it was based on a carnivorous plant, a sundew of some type, and it involves a lot of processes like distillation and purification, and then bringing all the essences back together. Then Radu feels ecstatic and rapturous joy and just excitement that he can barely contain, and he does feel its beneficial effects also on the conscious duplication, and he's able to exceed just the first going past the threshold of being awake. And it seemed like his consciousness was really like lazy and slow, but actually that was just part of his training. In time he could strengthen it, and especially using this essence boost, he has had to contain his excitement, but still he managed to in time go and trigger visions that were reminiscent of the holographic projections that he saw in the previous volume, and they were actually suggestive also of the Akashic field, but there were details that he had not seen before. And in two instances, first in the Council of Teotihuacan from 26,000 BC, and the other in the last stages of Troy. They involved extraterrestrials, and so it describes this different stages that he saw, and this got the attention of the Apelos civilization when they found out that he could see details that were beyond the scope of their device, because those machines actually are limited by the affinity of the user. So they're limited by two things, that, and the other thing is when it doesn't want you to see because of the ramifications, which is very rare. Only two instances in this whole series that he was denied and simply blurred out of information. And so he gets an invite again to corroborate these new visions, and this gets the admiration and better, closer relations with the Apelos, and it gets them an invite even into their town. And of course he was glad to go there again, and he gets to talk to Mentia, Mentia was the head of research. Her specialty was medicine, but also biology and physics. And their definition of medicine was far beyond what we have. And they stressed it a lot. So Radu gets through the teleportation that I described in our second video device to just get punched in directly from the hangar upper ground. This time he could see Apelos up close and personal, and he could enter a building. And before that, he described a capsule ship that took him very quickly, and there were arches on the street that would charge them, and it seated 4 people. And he got the feeling that Apelos, despite being only 70 kilometers on the ground, which is not even close to the other side of the mantle, which is the transition zone between 3 and 4 density, it still can be considered a 4D enclave just by virtue of the refinement of the civilization. And I'll go into what they're hybridized with a little later. And so they all the Apelos people showed a lot of tact and respect, but at the same time, and firmness, but at the same time, they were all generous and kind, and just inspired a lot of well-being. And so he admired them. They look mostly human, but whiter skin and usually dark hair, but not only black, also describes some brown. So he gets to visit their laboratory, which all their buildings were rounded, and inside as well, you didn't see angles or corners. And he said that he made a parallel with some really high-tech institutions that he saw overground, but that was on a new level. And even the elevator, for example, was made of transparent metal, and which created a little bit of vertigo at the beginning when he got out. And then even the panel on it was holographic and displayed the whole building, and the Apelos person, their guide, just had to do some gesture, and they were up in a matter of seconds. And then they got to this laboratory where Mentia was expecting them, and it was white and blue mostly, and it had kind of a pleasant hum, which is from the people inside them. It was a workplace, but it was very relaxing at the same time. And he described that most of the people were doing their work standing up and gesticulating in front of very large screens, 2 meters tall and 3 meters wide. And they were holographic. They not very thick, but still. And in addition to gesticulation, actually, the main method of interacting with them was voice, which is interesting. Then Mentia, with his permission, invites Radu to give him a non-invasive scan of his whole body down to the quantum, not just cellular level, because she was very curious after the results of the visions were confirmed as to what actually made him so improved drastically in such a small span of time, because those new visions meant that his consciousness was ready to see more than even the Apelos were exposed to in that particular instance. And sure enough, when he sat down on this, similar to a dentist chair, he got engulfed in a sort of white smoke cloud, very, very luminous. And he could see nothing else during it. And he gave him not just a telepathy, but what felt like a free and natural communication with it. It told him everything that was in order with his body, is the organs that were performing and the ones that were a little iffy, as well as everything that was wrong with his blood and all that. So after this ends, Mentia interacts in a really unique way with the screen that I mentioned was enormous. She was, by the way, ambidextrous, and she was very focused on this. It's like they weren't even in the room when she looked into these changes of his DNA, what triggered them. And she quickly realized that just the effects of the machine of the Eden project were not enough to explain his quick rise. And that's when they had to come clean about Eleanor and his potion. So that then stirred her curiosity and interest, and she could not hide it because she was fiery. She was very intelligent, very sharp, but at the same time, she was very determined. And so she just invited herself to meet Eleanor overground. And so before too long, actually the second day, they arranged for it. And when Radu let Eleanor know about her and their enclave there, Radu thought that he had to keep giving it all this exposition about inner Earth and the structure of the Earth, only to find that not only had he been there, but he had even been to Shambhala multiple times, which is Radu's most coveted destination. However, when he he was just about to ask him about the beings there, and he was going to gush about it. He got the feedback telepathically that it's not time yet, and you need to back off from Eleanor. And of course, Eleanor was all too willing to share it when it was ready, and he was, very happy to oblige and very on board with meeting Mentia. And also, when they got talking about the inner Earth, Eleanor tells him that after a certain point, if you become especially proficient at something, which in his case was alchemy, you will inevitably have to deal with Shambhala. It's basically a necessity, just in terms of mission for humanity. So I guess I wanted to ask also if you had anything to report before we move on, because the last bit about inner Earth, about like Telos and whether it's a 4th or 5th density settlements, and yeah, just if you have any parallels to what I've said.
I think Telos is 4.5 to 5D, and it just felt very light when I was visiting Telos. It just, everything is light. The clothing, the food, everything is pure energy. So it doesn't have the same density as 3D. It's much lighter, it's easier, everything is easier there. You don't need to eat as much, you don't need to eat meat. Your energy is constantly revitalized because it is a different dimensional capacity, so you're not tired. You just get rejuvenated instantly energetically. There's an energy frequency that is different in Telos. It's like just being in that place heals you energetically. It's just the energy field there that is very different. No pollution, no greed, no money, no issues. What we have here above ground is peaceful and harmonious in Telos. There's no problems, there's no drama, there's no constant distractions from what you want to learn and the job you want to do. You're just doing it. So what are the highlights of the book? Like, so what did they experience in Inner Earth, and what does the book end with?
So then Mentia gets overground, and I'm just going to go through the highlights, but you still need to know just at least these really cool tidbits that I took out. That so she spoke 23 languages. When she asks how do you talk with the other state, her IQ, she didn't tell him, but he found out that is 174, and there are 5 cities in addition to Apelos that are close to the surface that have been helping Romanians, but other countries as well, but from the backstage, and it was easier before, but now they still do it, even though it's more complex. So he gave an example of personality in Romania. So actually named her Caterina Teodoroiu. So anyway, a real hybrid that was half, inner earthling, interterrestrial. And he also that they have the technology to find out if a child that is born is a special incarnation of extraterrestrial, because of they get to see certain arrangements in the DNA, and so they see what race that belongs to, at least by and large, and that if it's special, then they make a concerted effort to support the child, which, by the way, happens mostly in the mountainside and the rural areas. And so, yeah, she keeps up with science, but not only through the normal electricity-driven data flows. She and they, in general, can access pretty much anything they want. So they're clued up to all the anything that's going up upstairs. And yeah, she took out a tablet that it was scaled down just to not scare the people on the surface to 2D, although it was capable of holograms. And she says that disclosure is a misunderstood subject, that it shouldn't be considered that the people would be scared. That's a scare tactic. I mean, that's designed to just keep the people in fear. And yeah, they're vegetarian, and they of course have means to get the essences out of the plants, but nothing on the par of alchemy. This is why she was so interested in Eleanor. And this is also the problem with their mission of restoring the DNA of humanity. So long story short, she and Cesar and Eleanor and Radu get to start a conversation, and she describes this mission of hers to restore the DNA of humans that had been badly damaged over time. And actually, Nordics were the most threatened of all, and almost in a way that is beyond help. That much deterioration has been going on, and it manifests, subtly at first, but it's very serious. And act now, she said that it's a now or never situation. And the problem with, because Eleanor even suggests that if she's so intent to bring this infusion of health to the people, then why don't they use their technology? And the problem with that is it would involve too many unilateral agreements and too much bureaucracy and disclosure of technology, because humans might actually use it for ill. And however, if they just snuck in a little bit of the essences or elixirs that of the magnitude that was used on Radu, but in the shape of like natural remedies and such, ointments and tinctures and emulsions, then that would actually be enough to just, if not stop, then at least stall the degradation of the DNA, which, by the way, is a mission not just for the upper civilizations, but for a lot of other extraterrestrials. So Eleanor took her proposal seriously, but she tried to explain that you can't go against individual karma, that you're doing just as much just as much harm if you're forcing good as if you're forcing bad. Because what if those people need to learn this lesson of being unhealthy and such? And he also goes in depth into alchemy, which I'm not going to cover here, but just it says that the mercury component or principle of alchemy is the only one that deals with healing, actually, and it's completely missing in allopathic medicine. And that the spagyric or plant-based alchemy has been around for centuries, but most of it was inefficient and just dyed oils, even in medieval times where it was at its height. And this is what contributed to its downfall, that there were charlatans even then, just as now. And it was pretty much more of the same in terms of efficiency overall of the medicine that was in store. And so anyway, in the end, they come to a sort of compromise. And this is going to be discussed in later volumes, because actually Eleanor implies that Cesar and Radu need to leave the room before they would finally settle on the plan. Luckily, Mentia is happy with Eleanor's input, and she remains on the surface for a while, also to guide and supervise Radu. She gives him a theta-inducing device, which helps him get into that state much faster, and which is the meditative state, of course, and that's conducive to out-of-body experiences. And so he manages to do a lot more jumps a lot quicker. And he starts off with the destinations that he's aware of, and he starts to map out the entirety of Romania, the places that are actually intertwined with the etheric and the physical. And after he makes more connections, he even complexifies from that. And after a while, he just sometimes found himself even not being guided by thoughts, but just by something else, by maybe the motivation of his higher consciousness or self, or which apparently is a thing. So yeah, he gets more and more focus, and with this, he's able to also see a lot of wormholes, which he takes advantage of, and he always gets the sense of where they lead. And also, they were a little flickering on and off at the beginning, and so this made Radu think that it was a problem with the software, and sure enough, he had Midas designed these changes around also the movements of the stars and planets. So just added more and more precision there. And after that, the wormholes were much steadier. And so at one point, Radu visits a US base in the desert. It was obviously a black project. There weren't too many buildings. He felt that, by the way, he describes that when you're in the etheric, and he also did some forays, did some excursions into the astral, but no more than that with this device, that he could ascertain, he would get so much information in such a robust way just by thinking, just by inquiring. For example, when he realized that this base that he was seeing that was in the desert was not S4, because he had seen pictures of S4 in his previous trip to America, he suddenly got the knowing of exactly what the base was, the name, and the fact that it had actually many levels underground, just only 2 buildings overground, and a runway and a concrete platform. And so he saw that on that runway, which is very short, by the way, there was a row of civilians, but also military people, and they were carrying some cargo. And inside, they were going towards TR-3B, but it was a newer model, so maybe not quite that name, but that didn't have any exhausts or something like that. And it gave him the impression that it was newer because it was more rounded and more aerodynamic and more streamlined. And he also mentioned that when you're traveling like this out of body, and of course this was like a step up because he could get it, he maintained his physical awareness. This is the main drawback when you're just doing the normal means. This is the main asset of this technology. But anyway, he said that when he's traveling that way, he doesn't just see in front of his eyes, he sees in the 360 manner, and that he's guided by his intent, and that he, like I said, the information is gleaned in a bulk way, like with the downloads. But so yeah, I wanted to ask you if it's the same for you in the sense of seeing 360 and being guided by your will.
Yeah, I see things in 360. I can watch things. I can observe anything I want. I can even touch anything I want. It's like almost physically being, and just I'm out of the physical body, but yet I have another energetic body type, so I can touch things if I want. But when I'm doing remote viewing, I'm just trying to observe and get as much information as I can, but not touch things, because it can affect even the etheric body. You can bring back an energy that you shouldn't have if you touch something. So I don't touch it. I just observe, I feel, I sense, I look, and I write down information in my mind. I already have everything cataloged. And as I do this, I'm also writing things down physically and drawing things. So I'm in one dimension out of body, but yet I'm physically aware and doing the physical remote viewing. So I can do 2 things at the same time. I'm in a different place, remote viewing and seeing things from 360 degree. I can see everything, I can go through everything, but I'm not physically touching it. I'm seeing all the detail and yet I'm physically writing it down and drawing it. So it's
So
just,
this seems familiar to you, what I'm describing.
yes, very familiar. It's like being out of body and yet having control of the human body. So the soul can be doing multiple things and energetically guiding things physically while being elsewhere. But Radu wasn't remote viewing. He was totally in the scape of the place. Me, I'm in the scape in the other place, but I'm also physically present and aware and writing and describing, drawing the things that I see out there. So it's like having a multi-dimensional capacity to carry out two separate things and do two separate things to make it as one. It's a discipline. I'm not sure how I do it. I just do it. And I try to teach that to my students.
But yeah, but I think it's actually not too dissimilar. Maybe that's just my assumption, but that he's also aware of these other planes, just gets the etheric information converted, and he still has his physical awareness in the background. That's what sets us apart. Maybe I'm just
it's a little bit weird to explain. It's just understanding how energy and frequency work and how you can be in multiple places at the same time doing different things but describing the same thing. Experiencing that on a different dimension and yet trying to make sense of it in the 3D world. This is the remote viewing aspect. I'm talking about just the remote viewer, because my soul is out there doing what I'm looking at and exploring, but my soul is also here in the physical body, writing things down and writing it down, what I'm seeing and experiencing in the remote viewing of my target, and also drawing it physically. I have a piece of paper and a black ink pen in front of me, yet I'm unfocused and yet I'm focused. So that one aspect of my soul over there is looking around at things and cataloging from 360 degree. And then that cataloging information is downloaded to the mind and it's drawing and writing. And it's on a piece of paper. I'm not drawing on a tablet. I prefer to draw on 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, which makes it even more difficult than a tablet because I can't erase anything. On a tablet you can, but I'm not allowed. When you're doing remote viewing, you can't erase anything. You're supposed to follow the old style format. Some people do it on a tablet, but I don't. I'm old school, pen and paper.
Right. So I forgot to mention also that this trip in the base actually ends quite suddenly when he gets spotted by a psychic. He was tall and in his 50s, and he just turns his attention, his gaze on Radu, although he was just floating, because that's how it usually is. He can go fast or slow. He can cover hundreds of meters in a few seconds, but in this case, he slowed down a lot to inspect that TR3B and where he was going, which, by the way, it got the download that it was headed towards the moon. And anyway, he gets spotted, and this scares him because it had not happened before, and because he knew that it was quite dangerous in this context. So he relates this to Cesar, and they decide that this is the impetus to disclose, to make this project official, because they have to be upfront and look, due to their other connections with the Pentagons and the Black Ops, to be upfront about having accidentally spied on those operatives and on that faction. And so they eventually, through their go-betweens, get to find out that they were indeed spotted, and they were identified because they were in those records somewhere through their. They were actually quite illustrious because of the Buchej thing, and yeah, that triggers the American side to contact them and actually make inquiries into their device. And they played it very safe at first, but they kept insisting, the Americans, and it turns out that they weren't just doing it because they were trying to intimidate, but because they had an equivalent device and they had problems with it. So slowly and surely, they through more and more exchanges, they eventually get an invitation, just provided that they don't disclose anything specific, just the general outline. And they get invited to Romania to see. By this time, the whole operation had moved to their facility and they got a lot more funding, which Cesar had to fight for. And so they could replace all those metals, which at the beginning were just substituted. And so now it was all that was cracked up to be in his original vision. And so the Americans were impressed, even though it had only been in operation for less than a year, to hear about their results already. And it was far ahead of what they had. And so this causes the Americans to invite Radu and Cesar over there in their deep underground military base. And it just goes to show how much power these people wield in a hidden way, that they were already set to travel there the very next day. And they did it in a really funnily shaped craft, futuristic, and that they didn't even need to show any documentation, and that the travel length was less than 4 hours from Romania to the American West, and that they traveled at 20 kilometers over the sea level, whereas it's usually 10 kilometers. So he was capable of space flight, from what he could tell. And so he wasn't allowed, Radu, to, before he could even present or inquire about it, they already showed that they knew about even his writings, and they told him that he could only give very faint outline of the deep underground military base. But he described that it was almost on par with the Apelos civilization in terms of technology, but not so much in the well-being that it instilled, that it fostered, because there was some a little bit, it felt like a cage, and there was this constant hum, but still it was incredibly well organized and clean and efficient. So it was spotless in that way. And they get led into their laboratory. And by the way, when it was a city and it was quite large underground, he could not make any call or any connection with this was the biggest stipulation from the beginning, with the overground. But inside they were treated very well, given their own apartments, and the technology that he describes as similar from a futuristic sci-fi movie, just that they could play around with inside the apartments. And so they get to see their equivalent device in their laboratory, which was inside of the building that Radu describes as the biggest building he's ever seen. And he was actually offered to command this machine, which was 4 years in the makings, and it looked more like a capsule and very well put together and very high technology, but it had a lot more shortcomings. He could see from the beginning that even though it managed to do the doubling in the etheric plane, that's about the extent of it, and it was very unpleasant from the start, the frequencies. And when he got out, it was also very unpleasant. And so all around, he couldn't project, for example, his consciousness to another location. And the whole idea behind inviting them was to figure out what was wrong with it. And they then gave their opinions, the Romanians, which the most likely explanation is that unlike the Eden, this one, which is dubbed the Twin Project, but there's also not allowed to call it, or the town, it was catered around anyone. And that's a mistake, because you want to focus on one person so as to fine-tune it. And the other problem was that it was using the latest and greatest, apparently, artificial intelligence, but that also translated to those really jarring jolts that he felt. And Cesar explains that when you get artificial intelligence that is sufficiently complex, it attracts also a soul, or etheric signature that will guide it, because it represents a body, if you want. It deals with matter and electricity, just like humans, and so it shouldn't be different. And the problem with that, with relying on that in that case, even though it's also potentially a good thing, is that they weren't aware of this fact that they also get ensouled like us. And so to circumvent this coarseness, they were advised by him to insert proportions and numbers in the program, in the software, that were considered sacred, such as the constant, the value of pi as much as you can, or especially the golden ratio and other ones like that. And if you do that, then the AI will not feel forceful like it did. It will be more harmonious with the user. And they were actually very open to all this, which showed that they had some previous knowledge, but they just couldn't fully get behind until Cesar further explained them, but it's not really covered too much, but just made reference. So the point is, they were pleased with their feedback, and they took it to heart, and they implemented all of those changes and invited them back about a year later, I think 2016. And this time you could see a huge refinement, and Radu was able to feel the frequencies this time enveloping him like a suit, and he could, without much trouble, travel to, just so happens, to the moon, because he remembered that that was the destination of the TR3B, so he just thought it's just as good a time as any, and he teleported himself there from Earth, and he saw that you had a cluster of wormholes, and he chose the one. Some of them also went to other places in the solar system. So first he saw a base that was on the bright side. It was inside a crater, but not in the center, and it was American, because it was cylindrical, the two cylindrical buildings, and they were united by three runways. And next he moves to another American faction, and also on the light side, but different architecture, and he could also see two flying saucers. They were pretty small, and a TR3B that was hovering 50 feet from the ground. And the architecture of the building was just a rectangle. And then he moves on to another one, just sees another portal, just capering about, and he sees yet another American faction. It was on the dark side and also had some craft there, and that's it, just no more detail there. Just gets attracted to a different type of imprint or feeling, or of an extraterrestrial variety, and he quickly travels like 200 kilometers in a few seconds and visits this also crater, because apparently all of these bases are in craters, that consisted of a round architecture, but also some strange shapes like half circles, and clearly not human. And then he just moves on to the next one, doesn't really stress any of these. And this one was abandoned. The one that I mentioned had vertical buildings, and the final one, also extraterrestrial, was active, and he could see some activity, but he was more so attracted to a hollow or an opening in the edge of the crater. So he immediately travels there with his consciousness, and there he could see that he instantly confirmed that the idea that the moon is hollow is even pretty well known, and also about the craters, that it's very conspicuous, the fact that they always end at the same depth. And not to mention the fact that the moon is also always facing us, and that it's all these proportions with the sun, that it's the same, and 400 times bigger in diameter than the sun, smaller, and the distance is also 400 times, all that stuff. So when he goes inside that hollow, the opening, he sees that it's actually all covered in dust, not unlike the one that's covering the moon, but in a slighter layer. And it disappears when you go deeper and deeper. So it's all just, it turns out to be basically like a layered onion, if you want to describe the shape, but it's all just titanium, which is also confirmed to have been found by the probes, I mean, from the rocks from the moon and other processed metals. It's all just basically a flagship of ET, which he says that could be at that point. He could suspect that it might have been the Neberau, but it quickly turns out to not be the case. And he sees that there were huge archways inside, that there were small and large rooms, and he normally would have seen nothing but pitch darkness there, but because he was in the etheric, he could perceive a glow. So it was something akin to twilight level lightness. That's about where it ends, other than there were also stairways that were enormous. That's about where this trip ends. And then, because he got this motivation to visit this in much more depth in his better device. So he tells the Americans that they're, on the right path, and they get some gift in return, but some technology that will help them with theirs as well, their device. And anyway, just quickly, I wanted to ask you if you can confirm whether you ever saw any cavity, I mean, natural formations in the moon, or whether you can confirm that it's all artificial.
Oh, I served on the moon, lunar space operations, on one of those US bases that's in a crater, and it's a large facility, whitish gray, circular, with connecting, you can call them tunnels or whatever you want, to other buildings. That was whitish gray, and there's like 32 to 42 levels. It has windows, it has apartments for the personnel, it has labs, it has offices, and then underground it has more research facilities for the more classified stuff. It also has teaching rooms with holographic technology where you learn about the different extraterrestrials, what you can encounter out in space. This is the first point of the SSP asset coming to the moon, and it's called Lunar Space Operations because they have more than one base. They have bases on other planets, not just the moon, and they're doing mining of asteroids. That's why it's called Lunar Space Operations. That's one faction of the US SSP, and that was built in the 1950s with an underground base, and then went on the surface as their technology became better. And then that's where what I have 2 years being on one of these bigger bases as an SSP asset. That was my intro to being in the SSP. Then I went to Mars, and they have domed electromagnetic bases covered with a dome frequency. So then that was 16 back, so that's kind of the short end of the SSP, but I remote viewed the moon, and I saw many different arches. I saw many walkways, huge. Everything was huge inside the moon. It was made of metal. There's hardly rock inside. So many different branching off levels. Like it's all in levels. And I saw 4 different engines, or what I call the world engines. 2 of them are active, and something happened to the other 2. So that's why this moon was parked and is stationary, because the other 2 engines don't work correctly. So getting it moving again, you'd have to fix those world engines, and that takes a lot of energy and resources. So it's been left parked, and the US military has its bases. Some ETs have theirs inside and on the surface, but I was interested in the inside structure. So it's all in compartments in different levels, and there's a huge elevator system that goes up and down. There's kind of like domes even built on some of these levels with different rooms and things. That's what I saw in the remote viewing. So that sort of backs up Radu Cinamar's recount of this. And I did the remote viewing last year, so it's in my book.
Great.
And I know nothing about book 7 because I have not read book 7, so I did not know any of this. This is the first time I'm hearing this from you about what Radu experienced seeing on the moon. Because I just know what's there from remote viewing, what's inside and what's on the surface, because I was on the surface space. That's in a crater. That's typical to have these round cylindrical bases with tunnels connecting to other circular buildings. They have those bases on Mars as well. This is the typical style for US military to build these kinds of bases. Some of them are protected by electromagnetic fields as well, like on Mars.
Yeah, and that's why you don't see them even with a high precision telescope. And actually, this is where it gets most interesting. I would say this is the conclusion. He actually goes into the origin of the moon because he got incited to find out from all this trip. So by this time, he had gotten to such good relations with the Apollos that they granted him unconditional access to the holographic hangar, and he took full advantage. So he goes there and inspects the moon, because even they apparently were curious. They of course had access to it, but not to these specifics. And so he says that he presents the information in a chronological way, but at the time he saw it in reverse. And so it starts with not necessarily the moon itself, but its interaction with us when it comes into the frame here. Somewhere around 95 to 98 million years ago, he saw that there was a Proto-Syrian civilization. It's extinct now, but you can definitely see the similarities, and they were basically the forerunners of today's Syrians. They were also pearly skin, and they also had that poise and respect for the laws of nature and the fire and determination. And also their skin, in addition to being white, had a little bit of blue tinge as well, and their hair as well. And their eyes were bigger than the later Syrians, but their mouths were a little smaller. So they were extinct, but they endured for a long time. And then it goes into like a synthesis of images showing that between that time and around 70 million years ago. So at the first instance, they were quite adept at the interstellar travel and all that, but still a lot of laws of time and space eluded them. But around 70 million years ago, he was shown a lot of changes in their DNA, although they maintained their looks more or less up to that point. And the fact that they kept hybridizing and expanding from, by the way, I forgot to mention that they started in Sirius A, this particular one. And they, through hybridization in the nearby systems, they managed to refine and get more grip on these special laws and principles of nature. For example, it showed that one of their earliest attempts at terraforming, which was just a satellite of a planet that was Earth-sized, and they had hastened the process and not given the atmosphere enough time. And this was to be expected. It was one of their first attempts, and the whole vegetation caught on fire, and the atmosphere, there was storms, and they had to start anew. Then he gets showed visions of their flagship that was traveling around Earth, and because Earth also qualifies as a nearby place for them, and Sirius A is the brightest star in our sky, and they also had a lot of affinity, it turns out, for Earth. But in this point of time, which was around 70 million years ago, the Earth was in a very different place than it is in now, because for one, it was engulfed in cosmic dust. So the camera showed from 800 kilometers in space how not just the atmosphere, but even the surroundings were encased completely in this dust that made it so when you were on the surface of Earth, it was akin to being inside a moderate sandstorm. And all you could see in terms of the sun, no such thing as a blue sky. It was all yellow orange. Of course, the vegetation was still lush and rich, and so was the animal life, but only in the sense it had reached a standstill, a stagnation of DNA. So the reason why they felt this connection to Earth is also mentioned in the previous conversation between Cesar and all those other people, that what really constitutes Earth as a jewel is the fact that it's not subject to really detrimental cosmic influences such as clusters of stars or it being, for example, near a big planet. It's very mild in that sense, which leads to the possibility of complexity in terms of DNA and evolution, and going in multiple directions because it's smooth in that sense. So they recognized that, but saw that so for example, there weren't even, not only were there no flowers, there wasn't even grass, although the vegetation was predominant, such as pine trees and cacti. The problem was they no longer evolved, and the fauna consisted mainly of many types of insects and certain reptiles, of course. So yeah, then the Syrians came down to collect samples of the soil and plants and such, and they could then see and confirm that the connections and the biochemical reactions were even more than they expected, but they were kept down by this dust, which because you can't get access to the solar and also cosmic frequencies except a very small spectrum. Also, the sign that they were compatible with the surface was that they didn't even have to take any special precautions other than a breathing apparatus over the nose and mouth. That's it. So the pressure and the climate was to their liking. And by the way, the reason why they terraform is either to settle it themselves or even just to foster evolution, just out of their desire to accelerate the development of races. And so yeah, it's in many ways it's a sacrifice. And by this time they had terraforming down to somewhat of an art. They decided to intervene, and it singles out a researcher that was in charge of biology and other, but especially that. She was called Orma, and she was silvery blonde. She looked about 40 at the time, and she presented certain projections and calculations and simulations depending on certain scenarios of interventions. So she presented them to the council there. One of the interventions suggested was an infusion of oxygen and other elements, and just importing flora and fauna from other planets, because the potential was clear in Earth. But this was dismissed because it wouldn't have led to more than a local effect. And so the next suggestion was that they would install a force field of planetary scale that would infuse the whole planet with not just one type of beneficial, energetic frequency, but a whole host of them, because if you just do the one, all the beings on the planet eventually get used to it and grow to be numb to it. So it would have to be very, very specifically calculated and elaborate. And she had this inspiration that in addition to the force field, what was also needed was to create an accelerated gravity from some source to pull away all this cosmic dust that was keeping the biology in a deadlock. So the first idea she offered was bringing a natural satellite of either Saturn or Jupiter, which would have enough mass to attract the dust and also to hook it up to technology so we would emit this force field. But also, this was also snubbed by the council because many reasons. For example, it would be costly to the host planet, for example, Jupiter, because even small moons have their purpose, but also the fact that they were still too small. And then they suggest a satellite that had a liquid center, which is the way it's described in this book is exactly like black goo. So that's pretty interesting. That's energetic and black, and has different shaped bonds. Although you can say it's water, it's not water like we'll drink. It's cosmic water. I just want to make that aside there. But this was also considered too overwrought. So what they did eventually, one of them is not said who, had this light switch moment that they should use one of their flagships that was already in use for a very long time and just use that for both the force field and the attraction of dust. And it just so happens that the best qualified one, and also the biggest in size, but it had been used for thousands of years already, and it had been a little obsolete in certain ways. So it turns out that the best equipped one was the one that they started this whole operation with. And so by this point, by the way, thousands of the Syrians had, Proto-Syrians had dedicated, their work life to this specific mission. So this was applauded, was embraced by them, and this made actually Orma famous in their civilization and beyond. This type of creative solution. Just a quick aside, do you agree with when Radu says that gaseous planets are not livable in the physical plane? That's why they consider that it wouldn't have been such a big sacrifice to tow in one of their satellites.
I really don't have much experience with that. I mean, it takes a lot for, I think some beings might be able to live in gaseous planets, but it's nothing that is bipedal and walking around. It's bacteria, it is microbia, that type of stuff that can live on gaseous planets, but it's not 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, sentience like us. It would be something small and microbial. So how does the book end?
Yeah, I was getting to that. It just also mentions that inside the moon, there were many types of cities. It wasn't just a uniform thing. They had quite a bit of variety, and they had elevators that would train-like and would windingly travel very quickly, by the way. They also had a huge engine in the center and these arcs, and it would generate white light. It eluded him, but it was definitely based on plasma and based on fission as opposed to fusion. Anyways, the point is the flagship of the Syrians is now the moon, and the dust that we see on it, which by the way contributed a lot to its ability to also influence us in terms of the seasons and all that, it was all very well calculated. So that dust, which is about 20 kilometers on average thick, that we see in the moon, is just the dust that surrounded the Earth at before. And it also says that it guarded at the time, in those early days, the whole Earth from the debris and fragments that were widely flying around at the time, of belonging to Maldek, the planet that was destroyed. That is the hypothesis of why you have the asteroid belt today is absurd, that the large planets collided with some cluster of comets or something like that. So of course we know that it's just a remnant of Maldek. My only question is whether Earth itself was a moon of Maldek. It's not said here, but whatever, I just heard it from one source, so I can verify. But yeah, the moon was also pivotal in shielding the Earth from fragments, because It was around the same time that the dinosaurs were also extincted, and it was not just the one obvious meteorite. It contributed, but more so it was the fact that Maldek got destroyed, which, by the way, he got blocked. He got denied by the whole investigate that. And it was actually just the lack of Maldek as a subtle presence for the dinosaurs, because they were finely tuned to it. And that's why the other creatures like the mammals flourished. And so that explains also the multitude of craters on the moon. And that explains also why you have very large moons on the very outskirts of Jupiter, whereas before that you just have very, very small, and it's a gradient, they stick out. And also it explains why you have Vesta and Ceres and the other fragments that were actually and also the moons of Mars as well. They are actually not just they are not former moons of Maldek, they're allegedly fragments of Maldek. So, but yeah, Ceres was a small moon, and that explains why the half of the mass of the entire asteroid belt is made of those extremely conspicuously large celestial bodies, which are those planetoids and asteroids, so-called, compared to those really tiny fragments. And the book ends with like a teaser that he was looking after seeing this and feeling this nostalgia for this erstwhile period. Something else caught his attention that he couldn't disclose at that point, but he gives the hint that it has to do with outer space, because he says that he was looking at the dark starry sky and he felt like bringing the stars to his soul, and he had no idea how quickly that would actually manifest. And also he kept alluding to many disclosures that would come in the upcoming book.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I appreciate your time and your kindness. And also the Apollos, you were going to say they were hybridized?
Oh, yes. I'm glad you mentioned the Apollos people. In his long conversation with Mentia, when she comes to the surface, by the way, they wore skin-tight suits. She never wore skirts or anything, and never wore makeup, but she was still beautiful. He called her gorgeous twice. So, but yeah, she goes into quite a bit of detail, more than you find in any other book about intraterrestrials, that not Thomasis, for example, they were pure blood additions, although they evolved at a faster rate. But in the case of the Apollos people, they were a sort of project of different civilizations. For one, you had Syrians, and I can only assume that is the same ones that created us, because they shared a lot of their characteristics, including aesthetically. And Pleiadians, actually, that was first and foremost Pleiadians, and another one in Virgo. And the rest was Dacian Romania, which is an old famous culture from Romania. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and this has been fascinating.
I'm glad. Yeah. And yeah, thanks. I'm glad we could do this, and definitely can't think of a better partner in crime for this series. And the 8th one, I don't know if you heard, will unfortunately be the last, although it was said at one point that there would be at least 10. Turns out he had a lot of difficulties, and I found out through Peter Moon that, not directly, but through the editor, that the reason for that is a lot of difficulties, no doubt, because of the stuff that had to do with astrophysics and alchemy that he was glowingly teasing in this volume. So it's unfortunate, but I'm glad that we will at least get a conclusion, and hopefully afterwards, full disclosure will make the rest a moot point.
Yeah, and we can cover book 8 when it comes out.
Of course, yeah, it goes without saying. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Anytime.
Have a good day.
Same. Bye.
Bye.